Good afternoon. I'm Soren Brothers, the Alan and Helene Ship Curator of Climate Change at the Royal Ontario Museum, and I'm delighted you could join us for today's Curator Conversations on balancing anxiety and optimism in climate change literature. This program was conceived of as part of a partnership with Fold Kids Book Fest, which was held from November 8th to 12th. I was so happy to be able to present as part of their in-person programming to celebrate young readers and writers and to celebrate the incredible power of children's literature. Before we begin, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that ROM sits on what have been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. I'd like to welcome my guests for today's program, authors Chris Turner and Mary-Lou Zeitoun. Chris Turner is an award-winning author and one of Canada's leading writers and speakers on climate change solutions and the global energy transition. His bestsellers, The Leap and The Geography of Hope, were both National Business Book Award finalists. His feature writing has earned 9 national magazine awards, and he lives in Calgary with his wife, Ashley Brinstow, and their 2 children. Mary-Lou Zeitoun is an Irish-Palestinian-Canadian author, essayist, and activist who is a mentor with the Toronto Arts Council's Newcomer and Refugee Artist Mentorship Program. Her first novel, 13, Porcupine's Quill, won the 2008 Young YA Awards, Young Adult Award at the New England Book Festival. Jamilah at the End of the World, which is on Warmer, is a comic young adult novel that addresses eco-anxiety and the intergenerational refugee experience from the perspective of Palestinian Toronto teen. But welcome. So my guests today, so just for everyone to know, they're both authors who use their voices as writers to engage with the impacts of climate change for different audiences. And I have both of your books here, they're up there too. And I was really excited to start by even just thinking about some questions for both of you, because I see a lot of common trends between these 2 books that I really enjoyed reading. And before I actually ask the first question, I just also want to mention for everyone watching this, all of the viewers, that I will encourage you to submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature during the program, and we're going to be live to answer your questions at the end. So please welcome and join me in welcoming Chris Turner and Mary-Lou Zeitoun. So the first question, thank you. The first question that I wanted to bring up is this idea of the focus on solutions. When I started working here at the ROM, I had a lot of time trying to think about where is the focus of our conversation today about climate change. Do we need more discussion about what's causing it, or discussions about the consequences of it? Or should we be putting all our energies into the solutions idea? And I felt that both of your books really had that kind of solutions orientation. And I was wondering if both of you had that kind of going into the thought process, even in terms of writing it, that this is what you were going to be focusing on. I'll start with you, Mary-Lou.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking, my book was kind of inspired by all the young people in my life who have terrible climate anxiety and started to Greta Thunberg, Friday school strikes and all that stuff. And now things have moved so fast. We're not just trying to call attention to climate change. And, you know, your Friday school strike is so 2018. We're so far ahead now, like it's understood that climate change, and we're more towards where Chris is coming in his book. We're about now we have to push the politicians to do the solutions.
Totally. Chris, do you feel like that was something that you kind of came into? I mean, and I know you're coming at this with a journalistic background too, and kind of on the solutions beat, maybe, as you would say, is, I mean, even, you know, thinking outside of this specific book, How to Be a Climate Optimist, was that, do you kind of avoid, or do you feel like you're avoiding talking about consequences and causes? And if so, is that because you feel like they're less pertinent for public to know about in terms of actually getting progress through? Or
no, I wouldn't say that's pertinent. I mean, I began nearly 20 years ago now, focusing pretty exclusively, not quite entirely exclusively, but certainly primarily on solutions in part because I felt that that was the much less traveled path. It was not nearly as, there was very little comprehensive at the time when I started my first book around 2005 or so. There was very little comprehensive about what a thorough response to climate change, what solutions would look like. At the time, you could still argue that the crisis itself was undercovered as well. It was not something that was covered in the daily news. It was not necessarily making headlines. There were not dedicated reporters on the climate beat, or it was often something that got sort of thrown in as one piece of an environmental reporting beat or that sort of thing. But I just didn't feel like I had a lot to add to that part of the conversation. Not that it wasn't important to tell that story. I just didn't. What am I bringing to this that isn't already there? And certainly, almost 20 years on now, I think that the divergence between my beat and the way climate change is talked about has only grown. That where you now do have the climate crisis is in the daily news. It does get covered as headline news. It is talked about, in political and business forums as a sort of top line issue. But still, the discussion of the comprehensive picture of what the solution side looks like is to my mind still undercovered, even though it is covered in certain sort of trade journals and things like that, technical journals. It does get a little bit of mainstream press. There's still, I think, a gap there, which to come to Mary-Lou's point, I think that's part of where that climate anxiety, I don't think it's where it comes from, but where it deepens is this, that like if all you did was watch the way mainstream news covers international climate talks, you would think that we were not making very much progress and hadn't for years, and the opposite's true. And so that's really, I think, particularly with this new book, the How to Be a Climate Optimist, I wanted to sort of say in a as thorough a way as possible, in fact, we are doing some really amazing things, and there are reasons to be excited about the future and not just fearful for where we might wind up.
No, I agree, and I almost think of it in terms of, I mean, here as a climate change communicator, you can almost think of like the shock value associated with different pieces of news, and no one's going to be shocked if you say humans are are causing climate change by burning fossil fuels, and there's almost nothing you can say at this point about the consequences of it that would shock people. But I feel like people are genuinely surprised when they hear about how far along some of the solutions are and how these solutions are progressing, to the same point you were making. On a similar kind of note, I feel that another common thread between both of the books is a sense of optimism. And I don't want to give away too much, in terms of the ending of the story, but neither book ends on a bad note, I would say. And of course, Chris, with yours, it's right in the title. I personally felt a little bit scared when people call me an optimist. I see it as kind of a personality trait more than, being a scientist, as a climate change scientist myself. I don't like it when someone calls me an optimist, because it's like, the same glass can be half full or half empty, depending whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. And I like to say there's lots of rational reasons for hope. But I'm wondering, and again, maybe I'll start with Mary-Lou, what your thoughts on, do you consider yourself to be an optimist? Would you label yourself an optimist when it comes to climate change?
No, I do not consider myself to be an optimist, and I have never in my life been labeled as an optimist. But the one thing that I find makes life hopeful is contact between people. And that's why I had Jamilah all alone with her vape and her anxiety. At the end of the book, it's kind of a happy ending. She ends up with community, and that's all we really have. That's the only life force. That's the only thing that is guaranteed to make you feel better, especially if you're a young person with anxiety. And my pessimism goes so far as, you're not going to like this, so far as to say, well, if we are all going to go down in a ball of fire, let's just make sure we're together and no one's alone.
And Chris, how do you feel? I mean, with the book title, would you call yourself still an optimist, or do you feel like it's a conversation starter?
Maybe a little of both, but certainly, in the book, I describe it as a pragmatic optimism. And what I mean by that is, I mean, I'm coming to all of this as with a journalistic background. Journalists, I think, by nature, by profession, have to be skeptical of official pronouncements, have to be skeptical of promises of utopian futures or great progress, or you need to kind of have a certain amount of skepticism and maybe even pessimism coming into the profession. But I mean, part of the reason why I describe it as a pragmatic optimism is I feel like, this has been my journalistic beat for almost 20 years. I'm not easily fooled by hype. I have, in fact, watched, what were marginal solutions, marginal technologies, political ideas that were way out of the mainstream come kind of crashing in. And I mean, I certainly never discount the fact that the climate crisis is very real, very deep, very much deepening, and is going to cause enormous chaos in people's lives for many years to come. But the optimism, the pragmatic side of the optimism comes from having seen this toolkit get so much more robust and ubiquitous. So particularly if I'm talking to younger audiences, I try to emphasize that. Like, look, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but the toolkit's there now. If I was standing here before you 10 years ago, I couldn't say that. And so that's really where I guess the optimism comes from, is being able to say, we're actually ready to fix this now. It's going to be hard. A lot of people are going to push back. It'll feel like we're not getting very far sometimes. And I think that's a big piece of particularly with the climate crisis. The scope of the problem, the timeline of the problem is so enormous that it rarely feels like you're really moving the bar very far. But having now looked at it across, a couple of decades, I can kind of say, look, we actually did. There is real progress. However you want to look at it, whether you want to look at some of the worst case emission scenarios that are now off the table because of the progress we've already made, whether you want to look at, the idea that the global energy industry was this, unmoving monolith that could not possibly be challenged. These things have actually shifted, and so there's a real reason to feel like we are ready to go now.
Yeah, I like Chris's point of plausible optimism. And that is something maybe I can hang my hat on. That's when I can get a little more optimistic.
I mean, I love how pragmatic both of you are. I think that's a really important thing to be having right now in any of these conversations too. Another thing, Mary-Lou, you were pointing out was the importance of the collective and of this community and the society. Again, kind of coming from the museum, as a climate change communicator, I had a lot of thought about between whether I should focus, or whether people in general should be focusing on individual actions versus collective community actions. And I feel like there's a double-edged sword with it. Traditionally, there's a lot of talk about individual climate change actions. We have to become vegans or travel less, or turn off the lights more. And you don't hear as much discussion about, say, decarbonizing the power grid or doing these kind of bigger collective things that are beyond individual behaviors. And I feel like there's a double-edged sword with that individual sort of communications line. One is the guilt that comes with it. It feels like you just mention it, and it feels like you're accusing people of causing the problem. And then the other part is the empowerment, the positive element that comes with it, where if you don't bring up these individual things that people can do, sometimes people might feel helpless, especially if they're, say, not yet old enough to vote yet. I feel both of your books have a focus on the collective and maybe the societal changes more than the individual level ones. Is that also something that you felt was kind of a conscious change? Have you ever sort of struggled with that divide, or did you feel like it was a natural approach just from where you were coming from?
I do think you're asking me first, right?
Yeah, if you like, either of you, yeah.
All right, I'm sorry. I do think intergenerational communication we have to mature as a culture. Adults have to talk to their children. Children need to feel comfortable talking to adults. That's been missing culturally in our society for a long time. And Jamilah's anxiety, a lot of it has to do with her family minimizing the climate change stuff she's concerned about. Yet her sister Noor feels good and solid because Noor, doesn't do plastic straws and is a practicing Wiccan and is fluid and just fabulous. But Jamilah's a bit of a dork, and she needs her family and her community to stop telling her it's her personal anxiety why are you so upset all the time? And the older people, and she does have one older person who communicates with her, and that's her grandmother. Her grandmother, who's a Palestinian refugee, who lives in the basement and cooks and is very funny and wise. And her grandmother's a bit nonplussed by the climate change stuff because, she's a refugee. She's like, bombs. Oh, they cut your water off? They cut your electricity? Oh, you had no. She's like, anyway, do you want my sugar now? And, you know, there's got to be more communication intergenerationally. I think that as a society, we have to mature about that.
No, I definitely, I see that. I mean, one of the things that I even love about working at the ROM is the intergenerational access that I didn't have, I felt, as nearly as much working as a professor at a university before this, where, you know, I was primarily speaking with students of a certain age range. And I think that having that, and also obviously within families and across families, but being able to share that information across these different stretches is really important. Chris, do you feel like is the focus that I'm kind of seeing in your book on the collective action and societal level action, is that accurate? And was that kind of planned or
yes,
intentional?
Sure. Yeah, that's, I mean, again, I think it's not a question of either or, it's more of a question of emphasis. I think a lot of the climate conversation devolves too quickly back to the individual responsibility, your carbon footprint, what are you doing? You should feel bad about that, you know, and also that very negative frame that a lot of that takes on, which you should be sacrificing because the world is in trouble because of what you've done. You know, this is true of lots of stuff besides the climate crisis, but especially true of the climate crisis. The scale, the scope, the timeline of it, all of it absolutely obliges collective action. Individual actions can be important to inspire collective action, to make people feel empowered that they can do something and aren't helpless in the fight. But ultimately, we need these sort of big systems of government, systems of economics, everything else that we do to begin moving in a new direction. And the only way you can do that is by getting together with other people who feel the same as you and pushing in new directions. And the great thing about that, and I talk about this in my book, is that actually is a lot of fun sometimes too. I mean, you know, as meaningful and sometimes quite anguished as you know, Fridays for Future protests are, they are also a community for a short. There are people coming together so that they don't feel alone in their grief or in their concern. Similarly, getting involved in politics, getting involved in, you know, local community scale resilience building, and all of these things, in addition to being good climate actions, are good for the soul. And so I think it's that's part of the reason why I encourage the collective over the individual. Is the individual will feed you, the collective action will feed you in ways that the individual action can't. And I think that's really important. We are very social animals and need other people with us to feel like we're making a difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a conversation just recently with a friend who was telling me about, you know, he was at a bar and talking to some people, and someone mentioned, you know, the same kind of thing that's kind of commonplace to hear. You know, if whatever country in the world isn't going to do, you know, major sacrifices towards climate change, why should we do it? You know, and it's always kind of like, you know, whether it's the US or whatever country, and it's always like the sacrifice. And one of the things that I love is kind of coming around to the sense, you know, whether we're talking about getting better relationships with our grandparents and communicating or our neighbors, or even improving our air quality or these other kind of things, like a lot of these climate change solutions are not really sacrifices, and we kind of forget that that there's another way of looking at it. And I think that that's a really important thing that's coming around, that I think, Chris, in your book, you mentioned that they make the world a much better place. It's not just less bad, but it's this real kind of shift. One of the things that I feel, you know, also kind of on a similar line, and thinking about our, you know, our society and our relationships within the society. I mean, Mary-Lou, you spoke about kind of also the identities and the political identities and social identities, and you have a whole bunch even just within the family in your book, within Jamilah's family and herself, kind of navigating them too. I mean, as a scientist, before working at the ROM, I worked at Utah State University. I was in a small conservative town in northern Utah, probably the most conservative town and maybe the most conservative state in the US. And teaching climate change there, I felt like I had to put a lot of thought and effort into taking the politics out of it, and trying to find a way to convince people that me teaching climate change and the science behind it and our understanding of the atmosphere had nothing to do with their political identities. It was, you know, and there's a fundamental background to understand, and there's no reason that someone, depending on what their political stripe is, should or shouldn't support climate change policies. These are good things for all of us. But we still sometimes get caught in that trap of sort of identity politics or tribalism. I was wondering if you feel, in terms of either of your books, that you have you ever thought about them in that lens? I mean, do you feel like they either contribute to or building up sometimes these boundaries, or do you feel like they break them down, or do you think they're kind of on their own plane? It's neither one or the other.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When I first start, look, I am just representing Toronto Gen Z experience, and it is, the Gen Zs are so effortlessly diverse and political, and they don't have as much tribalism amongst themselves, whether it be gender fluidity or ethnicity or politics. When I was writing the book, even as little as 4 years ago, I was editing how much I let the grandmother talk about Israel and Palestine, because it didn't feel safe to talk about Israel and Palestine in the culture yet. Something happened, just like with climate change, and now people are talking about Palestine, and there's Palestinian comedians on Netflix, and my book is normal. But even as little as 4 years ago, it would have been labeled as identity politics. And every time I did a review of a Middle Eastern novelist, or the Globe or something, I'd always get a rebuttal from a more conservative paper saying that, I was being ignorant or relativistic. And hasn't happened once with this book. It's full of identity politics, but we're ready for it. It's not such a taboo anymore.
So it's a bit of optimism for the future generation.
Oh, absolutely. They can have it.
Yeah.
They're doing a better job.
Yeah. What about you, Chris? Do you feel like, because I know you talk about your political, even running for office in your book.
I mean, I think what I certainly with this book, the intention was to contextualize climate solutions in a way that didn't pull them out of the political arena, doesn't deny the political arena, but suggests that there is a vision of a place that we can get to collectively that's pretty inclusive, that doesn't actually, isn't about winners and losers, isn't about this side victorious over that side, but sort of speaks to sort of the sort of collective values. And I think it's an incredibly important thing, and certainly one of the great lessons you learn if you get involved at the sort of retail scale with politics, to the point of like knocking on your neighbor's doors to ask for their vote, or ask for the vote of some candidate that you support. What you quickly, I think, learn if you're paying attention is that you can't just people aren't going to just bend, reshape themselves in the face of your far superior evidence, and how much more you've thought about this and this fantastic set of data or perfect PowerPoint presentation or whatever it is you've got. People come to any political issue, any issue in the public sphere, with their own biases, with their own concerns, with their own other priorities, and acknowledging those, I think, is incredibly important, because I think the really divisive thing that has been a little bit too prevalent in the climate conversation is this sort of with us or against us kind of mentality, that if someone doesn't understand the bleeding urgency of climate change and live it every day, they just don't care, that they're not interested, they're fine with the decline of ecosystems, the rest of it. And I think that lens, which comes from the sort of background of generations of environmentalism, of really great change and progress, can sometimes, particularly with something like the climate issue, which is so pervasive. I mean, you're not just talking about I want your support to get government to stop logging happening someplace else. You're talking about changing people's lives, how they get around, what kind of house they live in, how that house is heated and cooled and lit. These are personal issues for people. And I think you do have to try and meet people, where they live a little bit more than maybe is the natural tendency, because I think the people who are really engaged in the climate issue obviously feel like, oh my God, this is, if you can't see how important this is, I don't even know what to say to you. And I think learning to bridge that gap is incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I thought it was funny, kind of on that note. I saw recently in the US, there was a politician who talked about, electric cars are emasculating men, and it's masculinity should be tied together with our use of fossil fuels. And it's interesting the kind of identity, like the level at which some of the identity politics is coming through still. And it's like, it's I think at that point it's not necessary. I mean, there's no reason to think that a conservative voter or green voter would be more or less happy with a heat pump in their house. Some of these things just haven't made it into the politics yet.
And art can transcend. You probably made those students in Utah more comfortable with you as a person. You probably laughed and talked with them, and art itself, whether it be visual art or writing or film or stand-up, it transcends like nothing else these days. I don't know why. Like people just can't be told. They have to be cajoled. And art does that.
Yeah. Yeah, I found, I was surprised. I mean, I'd seen sort of other approaches, teaching approaches just through my life, of people even kind of approaching a class where they start by making fun of anyone who denies climate change. And I just saw it as, you're instantly taking X% of your class and making them not want to listen to anything else you're going to say for the rest of the semester. And, it's not the way to go. And it's much, I think, more powerful to engage with people and get on the same page and build some kind of mutual trust and respect, and then go from there. On that level, in terms of divisive people, it came up in our conversation. We had a prior conversation some weeks ago that there's a prominent Canadian environmentalist, climate change activist, David Suzuki, and he's now announced that he's retiring from the nature of things. And I remember in our prior conversation, I think Mary-Lou, you mentioned that you kind of indicated that he might have been influential for your own career. And I think, Chris, you maybe indicated that you see yourself as a different kind of communicator from David Suzuki. I'm wondering if both of you would be open to elaborating a little bit on your thoughts about him kind of at the end of these decades-long presence that he's had in Canadian psyche around a lot of our climate change conversations.
Well, he's a precious Canadian, commodity with a great legacy. He was the only one out there when no one else was out there. But I did a few years ago see a documentary where his daughter was so anxious, he felt guilty. He had made his own, I think she was a teen or in her 20s. So she made a clip or a film about him trying to help her find hope. And he did admit, I kind of made young people really anxious. And there is one chapter in my book that's called Thanks, David Suzuki, because she's like, you've been telling me about this up to her parents. You've been making me watch David Suzuki, and now we're sitting here and no one's done anything about it. So thanks. So that's how he influenced me. Just that he also needed to go a step farther, like Chris. He and Chris, I think, have teamed up. Have you?
Yeah. So I was going to say, certainly the baseline is, I have enormous respect for David Suzuki's career. He broke through all kinds of ice that we now, steam happily through, because
now
he was
melted.
out there. He's a fantastic communicator. He and I shared the stage when I was running for Parliament. He came to Calgary and helped rally the troops for my campaign. He's, obviously, has had an absolutely extraordinary, groundbreaking career. I think if we part ways at all, it would be that he comes from, when he comes to the climate crisis as an issue, he comes very much from a sort of ecological background, from the health of the planet. He's absolutely right to point out, as he has done again and again, that there are dire crises in the health of our ecosystems worldwide, that our habitual behaviors are continuing to erode and do damage. But it's tough to get from there, I think, to a place where people feel like you're offering them a brighter future worth kind of pursuing. Not that you can't get from there, but you're already starting. You start from a pretty dark place. It's a very difficult pivot from ecosystem collapse and extinction and that to let's talk about how your daily life could be much better in 15 years if you move to clean energy and better efficiency and the rest of it. And so I feel like certainly the work he's done has been vital and necessary, but that he's maybe not as well equipped to talk on. I've never really been. I did spend a summer knocking on doors for Greenpeace, but I've never really been kind of a sort of classic tree hugging environmentalist. I've always been on these sort of big system technology change kind of side of things. And I think we need all of those conversations, but I do think that it's a much easier case to be made for optimism where I stand than where he does, which doesn't make him wrong. It's just it's a harder package to sell when you've begun by saying, we are losing this vital ecological, and we are losing some very, very vital parts of our shared ecological heritage as we speak. But we do need to move past that, or at the very least have a parallel conversation about what we all want to build together.
Yeah, no, I can entirely see that in both sides of that coin. I mean, it's funny for me, David Suzuki. I mean, obviously, just growing up here, I was aware of him as a kid as well. But I went to University of British Columbia, and he was giving, he gave the opening talk for all the new biology students there. On my first day moving out to Vancouver, and so it was. He definitely played kind of a luminary role as well at that stage, and it's interesting to see. Yeah, he's still around. He still has such a prominent voice, and from what I understand, maybe there's a new program that he's going to be shifting into. So maybe there will be a different kind of orientation in terms of where that communication develops too. I think on that note, I'm going to ask maybe just one more question that's kind of almost more style oriented. And it's something that came up again reading both of your books. There's a tendency, and maybe this is just because I'm a scientist thinking about it, that, I think in the background, we've often kind of gone to scientists as sources of information for climate change or for politics. And we think about climate information coming to us from these kind of heavy, booky kind of sort of formalized tones. And I felt like both of your books really kind of burned through that. And they had like really kind of like nice, cool, casual tones, even in just how they were being, how they were expressed, even though, one is a fiction, one is not. But I'm wondering also in that, like, do you feel like that's a broader trend that you're seeing in the literature and how we talk about climate change? Like, I feel like it's a necessary shift that we have to just, again, feel comfortable with the people that we're reading from, and that we're making sure we're on the same page. And maybe that's just a kind of a background challenge of any author, of any writing that I haven't had to deal with. But I'm wondering also your thoughts on that, or whether you see that as a broader trend that you're part of, or is this just kind of a new thing maybe?
I think it has a lot to do with literary nonfiction and the canon of literature being less old and stuffy and British in the world. And now we can talk how we talk. And literary nonfiction uses beautiful sentences, beautiful prose to just usually embeds the writer and the journalist in the experience. With you, I was a music journalist before this, and that was a big no-no. But now it's completely accepted. So a more colloquial tone doesn't mean that you're dumb now, and it used to.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is the added challenge in the climate conversation is that it begins from science, and scientists, for very good reasons, value precision, value using the very specific and technical term over a general one in their own communications with each other, in their formal communications as scientists doing science. And that there tended, I think, probably to be more reverence around that among journalists, communicators, people trying to tell good stories for too long. And I agree with Mary-Lou. It's great that we're getting to a point now where we realize, oh no, we need to talk to people the way they talk to each other about this, and not like someone giving them a lecture. You lose a huge chunk of your audience that way, and we need to talk to everyone. So
And people shouldn't be afraid of becoming writers. I want young adults, especially from diverse and marginalized communities, not to feel intimidated, because they can't write flowery. And when I do workshops with kids or even older people, I say, if you can talk, you can write. And I think one of my mentors, Roddy Doyle, the Irish writer, said that thing to me the first time I had a workshop with them. And it's really true. But the one thing I can't help you with is if you're boring.
Damn it. Well, on that note, I want to thank both of you for joining us for this program and congratulate both of you on your remarkable work.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we do have a few minutes to answer audience questions now. Yes. And as a reminder to the audience, everyone who's here, these can be forwarded through the Q&A button on your screen. And we already do have a question here from Didi. And I'm just going to read it for you and I'll let either or both of you answer. What do you think about the movie Don't Look Up? I've been thinking about why we're not taking actions we need to put out the fire. Brackets Greta Thunberg famously talked about our house being on fire. There's a book called Drawdown and movies like Eating Our Way to Extinction with practical solutions. I wonder how much a culture of the pursuit of positivity and masculinity, brackets identity politics, has prevented expression of the fear, grief, and anger that people feel about ecological collapse. I think we need to feel these difficult feelings to be able to make the deep systemic changes we need to make. And either of you want to
asked and answered. One of those questions where they basically asked it and then answered it. It was beautifully written too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I would say on the one hand, a movie like Don't Look Up, I think it's great that movies like that are being made and being watched, and that are pushing forward the conversation. One of the things I would say just about it specifically, though, it's indicative of some of the writing and storytelling and movie making around climate to date, is it fairly deliberately misrepresents the climate piece of it to make its rhetorical points or its satirical points. It's a very good critique of mainstream media and their response to scientific problems they don't understand and the way they enable a political class to manipulate and defang an issue. But by recasting climate change as a single discrete disaster, it doesn't really open up as much. It kind of shrinks the issue down to something really small that we can then use to bounce this media satire off. Very, very good movie, well worth seeing, but is more a media satire than a climate change satire, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also, it's one of the many pieces. I don't know how any art's just not going to be about climate change going forward. Like, we're going to get a glut of the plague COVID books in the next, 5 to 10 years. And how can you write about anything if you're being in the middle of a wildfire? If you're in the middle of the wildfire, it's going to be very Hunger Games kind of books. It's going to be very interesting seeing what comes out.
Yeah, one book I would point to as a very good, very comprehensive and plausible kind of it's not a utopian book, but it is ultimately optimistic, is The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a sci-fi writer, has been writing about climate, has been writing cli-fi as it's sometimes called, for a while. But that book in particular, I think he quite deliberately tried to say, I'm going to create a future scenario where disaster has happened and humans have had to respond to disaster, but where the response actually points in a sort of plausibly optimistic direction, very very heavily couched. And even he kind of does the same trick where there's this discrete disaster that triggers all. And this has been one of those things that I actually talk about with a certain degree of criticism in my book, the idea that there's going to be a single moment that wakes us all up to the scale of the crisis. I don't think that's coming. I think we're going to need to build solutions without everyone having suddenly realized that they had it wrong or whatever. But that book, Ministry for the Future, I think does a really good job of sort of painting a for the reader a future world that definitely has some dystopian kind of flourishes, but feels like, oh, that might be actually kind of a a less than worst case scenario, I guess.
Yeah, it's been recommended to me by others as well. I haven't read it yet, but I will do that. I have a couple other questions coming in here. An anonymous attendee said, what would you consider to be the most optimistic thing that you've recently seen regarding the climate movement?
In my community, there's a climate resilience, the Centertown community climate resilience group has started, and they're really organized, and they are ready to help guide the politicians about where they should put their money and their energy and their focus. And that, for me, is something I didn't know was around 2 years ago, and I'm a part of it. And I look forward to working with other people about the idea of like working together to not live in a heat island. What you can do in the middle of a city so you don't live in a heat island, rather than just helplessly going, well, I live in pavement and sidewalks, so this is how I'm going to go. There's lots of things that we can do, and as you said earlier, Chris, it minimizes the anguish when you can share with other people.
It at least gives it something to bounce off of.
Yeah.
Great.
I would say the most optimistic thing I've seen last little while is it's about 2 months ago now, the largest solar installation in Canada came online in southern Alberta, not far from where I live in Calgary. That sometimes comes as a surprise to people who follow Alberta politics, that Alberta would be Canada's leading jurisdiction for renewable energy now, but it is. And the reason why that's particularly encouraging to me is it indicates that these tools that I've been talking about, this sort of climate solution toolkit, has in fact moved past the point where it needs government champions, where it needs a giant public protest to get it to where it needs to go. This is a government that's probably the most indifferent, if not hostile, to climate action, also being host to Canada's most robust renewable energy industry, not because of anything they've done, but because simply solar panels are cheap and ubiquitous now, and they're the best solution in a whole bunch of different contexts. And often when I'm giving talks on this, I contrast that Alberta is now a leading jurisdiction for solar, and so is Vietnam. And there are two very, very different parts of the world with very different sort of levels of development, extremely different political ideologies, both of which are seeing the same tool, the clean tool, as the best tool for their energy future. And I think that's the kind of shift that that builds, that is the engine of the optimism that drives my book.
Well, that's great to hear. Anonymous attendee has also asked, what nourishes you as writers/humans, even as you take these deep dives into difficult times?
I have, like most people, a need to be heard. That's all. Like most writers are just bearing witness. And also, I'm an artist, and dancers have to dance, singers have to sing, writers have to write. It's really quite simple.
Yeah, and on a similar note, I would say that, what drives it, like I think one of the, in a sense, almost encouraging things about both what's happening on the climate front and what we saw during the pandemic was a recognition fairly widely just how important and vital and fundamental to human society storytelling and art are. And that's obviously, I do what I do, one, because I don't have the technical know-how to run a solar company or do climate science or whatever, but two, because I think storytelling is one of the most sort of valuable things you can contribute to a society. And so it's been great to see, one, that I think we've got a renewed sense of that maybe in the last few years, and two, that the ways that we're telling climate stories seem to be becoming more robust by the day. So these are encouraging things.
It's interesting hearing with the work too. I've told people as well before that sometimes doing research, and for me, I study lakes and the effect of climate change on lakes, and sometimes that becomes almost like a climate therapy, where it's like I can contextualize it and put my fears of climate change into a specific question that I'm investigating, and that can sometimes almost help me sleep at night. If it's like, oh, well, what happens if you warm all the lakes by this many degrees, and the ecosystem responses are going to be like this, and there's different ways that I think that we can kind of focus on what we're doing, and it becomes a positive thing both for ourselves and for the world outside too. So on that note, I am going to thank all of you for joining us, and thank you, Chris and Mary-Lou, for sharing all your thoughts on climate change
for having us.
subjects in literature.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It was really great. It was really fun. And we hope to see you again at future ROM programs, both digitally and in person, hopefully some point. And more information on upcoming programs can be found on the ROM website. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.